Hello, everyone. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast coming at you with another episode. I got the great Scott Horton here on the line. He should need no introduction to the podcast here, but he is the director at the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, host of Anti-War Radio in LA and the Scott Horton Show, author of the 2017 book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and he's conducted over 5,000 interviews. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. So I kind of brought you on. I'm no foreign policy expert, but I try to be a student of foreign policy. So two of the most kind of seminal events that have really piqued my interest have been the Iran-Contra Affair and the Iraq-Iran War of the 80s, and us funding the Mujahideen in the 1980s as well. So I thought I'd bring you on to just ask you a couple questions and get the explain it like I'm five version. So is there one that is more important to start with than the other?
No, not really. Whatever you want to do.
Why don't we do Iran-Contra then?
Okay. So the background to Iran-Contra, of course, is that the whole thing took place in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. So a little bit of background. In 1953, the CIA overthrew the government of Iran and reinstalled their dictator, the Shah Reza Pahlavi. 26 years later, in 1979, there was a massive popular revolution in Iran that overthrew him and installed the Shiite clerics, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his people in power there. And then about 9 months later, there was a hostage situation that broke out because Jimmy Carter was convinced to allow the Shah into the U.S. for cancer treatment. And the students in Iran took that as a signal that America was going to try to reinstall him in power. In fact, he was dying. It was way too late for that. But that was what they thought. So they rioted and they seized the American hostages, leading to the Iran hostage crisis and the real beginning of the American Cold War against Iran. And almost always people conflate those events as though it all happened at the same time. But it was the original revolution was in February and the hostage crisis broke out in November. But anyway, Saddam Hussein had a problem. And that was that he was a Sunni dictator sitting on a 20% minority dictatorship, lording it over the supermajority Shiite population of the country, 60%, and also the other 20%, the Kurds. And he was really worried that in fact, Shiite Islam was born in Iraq and then, moved east into Persia from there. So, every year Shiite pilgrims come into Iraq to visit the holy sites and all this kind of thing. And Hussein was really worried that the Shiite revolution was going to come in and tear Iraq apart. So what he did was he conscripted all the Shiites into his army and attacked Iran and tried to overthrow them. And in fact, what had been sort of a ramshackle new, government that they were just putting together ended up being solidified in power. War is the health of the state. And the people of Iran rallied around the Ayatollah and the mullah's regime in order to defend themselves against Saddam Hussein. So America backed, starting with Jimmy Carter in the beginning of 1980, and then all through the Reagan years, America backed Saddam Hussein against Iran. But at the same time, they kept a secret relationship with Iran. And it began with the October Surprise, which was a secret deal basically run by the CIA, who were still loyal to their former leader, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice presidential nominee, and his campaign with the Iranians to hold the hostages longer and to have American hostages being held in Beirut, Lebanon by Hezbollah held longer in order to embarrass Jimmy Carter and make him the weakest candidate for Reagan to run against. And then on the day Reagan was sworn in, they let the hostages go. And that was, known as the October Surprise, was that secret deal. Well, the channel that they created for that, they actually kept open. And they had this sort of, back channel arrangement going on with the Iranians that kind of came and went, but it sort of, was there all along, at least in the background. And what happened was they came up with this scheme to try to finance the right-wing death squads down in Nicaragua and El Salvador, which Congress had banned them from financing. And they figured out they could finance them by selling weapons to Iran to use against Iraq. And then they would take all the profit from that and they would spend it on the right-wing death squads down in Latin America. And so that's why it's not just the Iran scandal, but the Iran-Contra scandal. And by the way, when they sold these weapons to the Ayatollah, they did it through Israel. Because despite all the crap you hear from the Israelis and their fifth column in America all day about the evil threat of radical Islam in the form of the Shiite government of Iran, they stayed friends with Iran for 13 years after the revolution, all through the 1980s. They were still friends with the Iranians because that was what fit their strategy. They didn't decide to change that until for domestic political reasons, nothing Iran had really done, in 1993, 1994. And so when Ronald Reagan said, and his government said, now it's time to sell weapons to Iran, they used the Israelis to do it. And in fact, they admitted at the time, they talked about, there were, different members of the Reagan administration said, well, we really didn't want Saddam to win. We just wanted them to keep fighting. And so when it looked like he was getting too far ahead, we'd tilt toward the Iranians. And when it looked like the Iranians were getting too far ahead, we'd tilt back towards Saddam Hussein again, just to keep the war going and in order to weaken both sides, essentially, all the way through the 1980s. And then, of course, there were massive consequences of this, in the most immediate sense. Now, after the war, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in a dispute over war debts, money that he had borrowed from Saudi, UAE, and Kuwait in order to fight the war against Iran, which he saw as actually defending them too. And they wouldn't negotiate. Basically, they were putting the screws to him. And so he decided, well, screw you, and invaded Kuwait over it. Now, that's the very short version of that. But then, of course, from there are all the consequences of the no-fly zones and the permanent blockade and the dual containment policy. Saddam Hussein, after Iraq War I, was too weak to contain Iran anymore. So now America has to stay in Saudi Arabia in order to contain Iraq and Iran, says the Israelis. Therefore, Clinton said fine and kept that policy. And, of course, that's the policy that turned the Mujahideen against us. Now, that was the second part of your question. Who's the Mujahideen? Well, at the same time Jimmy Carter was backing Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran, he started an operation along with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fighting against the communist government there. In fact, he signed a finding on July 3rd, 1979, authorizing the CIA to begin to support the Mujahideen in order to try to provoke the Soviets into invading. They weren't trying to scare them away. They were trying to provoke them into doing something stupid, which is what they did. By Christmas 79, they invaded. And so this is why when I tell the story, I should always do this part first because it works more poetic, like in the chapters and stuff. That's the way I have it arranged in the book. Anyway, so America supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan all through the 1980s in order to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy, as bin Laden would say about us years later. But anyway, getting ahead of myself there. And it worked. It was an absolute catastrophe for the people of Afghanistan. The Soviets probably killed 1 million people in their carpet bombing campaigns and all the rest of it. It was absolutely, nightmare what happened in that war. But at the end, the Soviets withdrew, and it really was one of the things that broke the camel's back in terms of Soviet power, and their empire completely disintegrated, right during that time. 1989 was really, late 88 through late 91 was the, from the very beginning to the very end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the fall to the end of the fall of the Soviet Union, right during that time. And so then going back to the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War being Iraq War I, and the aftermath of Iraq War I being the permanent containment policy, dual containment from bases in Saudi Arabia. That is what turned the Mujahideen against the United States. And they essentially planned to do the same thing that we helped them do to the Soviets, which was provoke us into invading Afghanistan. So they could bog us down and bleed us to bankruptcy. The same thing our CIA had helped them do to the Soviets in the 80s is the same thing that we are doing to ourselves at their instigation right now. Unfortunately for the people of Afghanistan, we can afford to stay twice as long as the Soviets could so far. Although we're asking, the Saudis and the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese to pay our way while we're doing it, and the Federal Reserve buying up debt with new money. But that's basically it. So, the Iran-Contra thing it's sort of a side issue, but it's at least an interesting entryway into the discussion of American support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in Iraq. That was the primary policy. And then just brings up the crazy question of, well, what do you mean we were back in the Ayatollah too? That this is the way America does business in that war. We don't just support Saddam Hussein, but we also support the Ayatollah against Saddam Hussein. And of course, the support for Saddam included American satellite information so that he could target the Iranians with chemical weapons, with sarin and tabin. I mean, horrible nerve gases, as well as mustard, which he used to great effect on the battlefield against Iranian conscripts. And the war is an absolute catastrophe. About 500,000 people were killed on each side of the Iran-Iraq war. And, it's just, I guess it's a nice little window into this is the way these things happen. And you can see how, each one of these things just leads to the next and leads to the next. Once Bill Clinton's dual containment policy gets our towers knocked down, well, then we get to pretend that history just started. And now we got to go and triple down on all the horrible policies that got us attacked in the first place.
Well, yeah, and I think that was my major surprise. So a few years ago when I started trying to get into foreign policy, I started with America's War for the Greater Middle East.
Excellent book, yeah.
Yeah, it was really good, but it blew my mind because I was a child of, I was in third grade when I'm dating myself, but I was in third grade when 2001 happened. I know as a young person, I know people say dating themselves when they refer to old, but so it just blew my mind that we had actually supported Saddam Hussein. And at this time, I didn't know who the Taliban were as opposed to Al-Qaeda, because it was a big mythos that you just kind of grew up with and accepted as fact.
And remember now, it was George Bush's father was the vice president when Reagan supported Saddam Hussein. So it wasn't just we did. It was these very same men.
Right.
Colin Powell was Reagan's national security advisor. Cheney was in the House of Representatives at the time. But essentially, these were the Reaganites, the very same ones who supported Saddam, were the very same ones who then turned against him.
So was it kind of the case like in Iraq War I, the Gulf War, where we were blowing up essentially military equipment that we had given Saddam Hussein in the Ba'athis?
Not exactly, because in Iraq War II, and really even in Iraq War I, the Soviets were armed, and this is, funny irony. I have a quote in my new book that I got from the New York Times where they laugh about how Saddam, supported by the U.S., was attacking Iran with an army completely armed up with Soviet weapons.
Yeah,
and the Iranians were resisting with American weapons. The Iranians were, driving American tanks, flying American F-4 and F-14 fighter jets, that their entire military had been built up by the Americans. And so America was supporting a Soviet military against an American one for most of that time. It really is American foreign policy as a Bill Hicks joke. Seriously.
Right. Well, so under the most charitable view that we could give it, is there any kind of sense that makes? I mean,
well, it's yes. Essentially, yes. I'm not saying it's rational from a libertarian's point of view, but from an American imperialist point of view, they do what they can, and essentially the project is for total hegemony, as they call it, dominance in the Middle East. And it used to be, of course, that a major part of that was their alliance with the Persians, and the same thing for the Israelis. And this is, to both, this is, the revolution and the loss of Iran in our sphere of influence has been, a major frustration, because Persia is just too big to invade. It's 3 times the size of Iraq with 4 times the population and mountain ranges everywhere and the latest Russian anti-aircraft weapons. And it's just essentially uninvadable. And it's not 53 anymore. So they can't figure out how to do some kind of CIA coup d'etat. It's just not going to happen. They don't have the foothold there to accomplish anything like that. And so they just constantly pretend that the Iranians are making nukes and wage this Cold War against them. And this massive sanctions campaign, whether it's Bush, Obama, or Trump, and just try to keep them hemmed in until they can figure out a way to co-opt them, which they really can't. I mean, and this is the whole thing of it, right? Is if Ronald Reagan could sell missiles to the mean old Ayatollah just a couple of years after the revolution, just a couple of years after the Beirut bombing that Iran's, the Iranian supported Amal militia did that killed the Marines in 1983. If Reagan can sell them missiles just a couple of years after that, because, hey, business is business in international politics or whatever, then what right do we have to continue to hold a grudge against them right now? Why can't the Americans, all other things being equal, okay, why can't America be the world empire less Persia? Because shrug, screw it, right? That's essentially been our attitude about Cuba ever since 1963. Jack Kennedy promised the Soviets, okay, we will never invade Cuba again. And you have our solemn word on that, and they never invaded Cuba after that. In fact, they stopped doing the coup d'etat, the assassinations after that, the attempts on Castro after that. And they just, as embarrassing as it's been, they've learned to live with an independent Cuba 90 miles off our shore. Well, so what if we have to live with the fact that the Iranians declared independence from our empire? I mean, does that hurt your feelings and ego and you feel like you have to set something on fire over that? Or actually you don't care? Because I don't care.
Right. Well, doesn't that play into Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think it was, had this idea of the world island? Is it the Middle East and Afghanistan area? Yeah.
So this comes from a British naval theorist named Alfred Mackinder. And basically the idea was, the British, the analogy is the same. This is where Brzezinski got this from. America, like Britain, is a naval power first and foremost. And that's how we, get our work done in the world in terms of imperialism. And so that leaves a lot of hinterland unoccupied and uninfluenced by us. And yet, if you look at the map, not literally, but figuratively speaking, Moscow's right in the middle of Eurasia. It's obviously far to the west overall in the scheme of things. But figuratively speaking, it's sort of right in the middle, right? It's at the border between Europe and Asia, wherever exactly you draw that line. And so the idea is, and this isn't necessarily true, I don't guess, but the idea is that if England and now America don't have a major foothold in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, for example, that then these areas will be dominated by Russia. And if they're dominated by Russia, then I don't know. They'll be dominated by Russia.
Right.
Why are you or I supposed to care about that? Same thing with is Iran having power. I don't care about that. And I'm not sure why we're supposed to care about that, as though, all power on earth is a zero-sum game. And at any cost, we're supposed to deprive the Russians of the prize of Afghanistan. Who says they even want it? After their own failure there in the 1980s and our own failure there after the last 20 years, why in the world, what brand of crack would Vladimir Putin have to be smoking to try to come and take Afghanistan after we cede our influence there? And who cares if he does? It has to go without saying. You have to accept the premise. It's like religion. You have to believe in it before you start thinking about it. That way you know it's true. Okay, but it doesn't make any sense that America has to be the dominant power in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, or Eastern Asia for that matter. This is the middle part of North America. This is the new world where people leave the old world to come here so they can be free and mind their own business. Why the hell would we be the dominant power in Eurasia, in the Middle East, on the border between Ukraine and Russia, in Persia, in the China's west, where they're dealing in the Xinjiang province with the Muslims there, backed by America and Turkey. And the whole thing is completely bananas. And this is why they have to dress it up as America's mystical destiny to lead the world. And this is why they have to dress it up as defending the American people from terrorism. Because if you just take some guy from Kansas and tell him it's his destiny to work an extra 15 hours every week so that his government can be the world empire, and not to any end that benefits him or the American nation at all, but just to make them feel better and help them to cash in on, all the influence peddling and everything that comes with the defense budget and all of the rest of that. They tell you you're crazy. And that's why it takes George Bush to say they're going to nuke you if you don't let me have this war. And then right-wingers will say, well, if that's true, then let's go kick their ass. But go and stay and fight for 20 years, that doesn't make sense even to the most muscle-headed, knee-jerk, reactionary kind of right-winger, that it would take 20 years to kill 400 men. Even if you want to have a bonus war and kill Saddam Hussein and his people, too. Install Iran's friends in power. Okay, but still, 20 years? And so, the average American just has no interest in this. That's why they always have to lie. They always have to dress it up. They always have to pretend that their enemy is Hitler. Remember they said Saddam Hussein. No, you don't remember. You were too young. When I was 14 and they started Iraq War I, they said Saddam Hussein was Adolf Hitler. And remember how Hitler took over all of Europe? Well, that's what Saddam Hussein is going to do. He's going to conquer the entire Middle East if we don't stop him now. Well, they knew that they were lying about that. They knew that the princes of Kuwait had insulted Saddam Hussein to his face. And in fact, they had said, I'm trying to remember who it was that told me this. It might have been Andrew Coburn, that the Kuwaitis had made some crack about how, if the Iraqi war widows are sad, or if Iraq is too full of sad war widows, maybe they should just send them to us and we'll take good care of them. Right? Imagine somebody talking like that about the Gold Star wives of America. They're like, oh, that's fine. Just send them this kind of insult. Saddam Hussein wasn't going to take over all of the Middle East. He was just teaching those Kuwaitis a lesson, was all. And by the way, and you can read this 100 places, including in my new book coming out. But you can read it in the New York Times. You could ask Ross Perot during the debates of 92. The George Bush government told Saddam Hussein, go ahead and invade northern Kuwait. We don't care if you do. The only problem was he went too far and took the whole country. That's how confident he was in their support, that he went too far. But then as soon as they reacted against it, he promised, I'm not going to Saudi. I'm not invading anybody else. And he tried to spend the rest of 1990 negotiating his way out of Kuwait with it saving a modicum of face, and Bush wouldn't let him do it. The whole thing, they just lie. They always lie.
I recall you interviewing Andrew Bacevich, I don't know, a few months ago, where you were talking about this exact topic. And it seemed to me like he pushed back a little bit on that idea that Saddam would just invade Kuwait.
He just doesn't know about it then.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say.
Right, yeah.
Maybe he just, I actually haven't read that part of that book. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what, position he had during Iraq War I or what. I should talk to him about that. But, I got all the footnotes actually in front of me. I had the long version of my book that I threw out when I started over. I actually have it here. And if I had to, I could go through and show you the footnotes from. I have the direct quote of April Glaspie telling the New York Times, well, nobody thought he was going to take all of Kuwait and all the rest of it. And Chelsea Manning finally leaked the American version of the State Department cable summarizing April Glaspie's meeting with Saddam Hussein, and where she essentially gives him the green light to go ahead and invade. And it's very close. You know, they always said that the Iraqi version of the minutes of that meeting were not accurate. And then so people always said, all right, well, show us your version then. Well, only finally Chelsea Manning released that in 2010, and it's essentially the same. You know, I do have, it says, well, no, I'm not going to sit here and read it to you, but I have the quotes right here. Yeah. Here's from the State Department thing, their version. Note, on the border question, Saddam referred to the 1961 agreement and line of patrol it had established. The Kuwaitis, he said, had told Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak Iraq was 20 kilometers in front of the line. The ambassador said that she had served in Kuwait 20 years before. Then as now, we took no position on these Arab affairs, which is exactly, as almost word for word, what the Iraqis had quoted her saying. We have no opinion on your Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary of State James Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first giving to Iraq in the 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America. And then Glaspie told the New York Times, obviously, I didn't think, and nobody else did, that the Iraqis were going to take all of Kuwait. And then other senior officials told the New York Times that they expected there would simply be a limited invasion that they could, quote, live with. And so, whatever. Well, and this is the long version that nobody's going to get. You're going to get the truncated version of the new book that comes out. But I will say, in fact, I don't think this was on purpose. Like, if you wanted to conspiracy theorize about it and say it was all an entrapment, you could make a solid case. But the CIA and the DIA, or the CIA and CENTCOM, were telling the Kuwaitis to be tough and talk smack and don't give in to Saddam. At the same time, the State Department was telling Saddam Hussein, hey, if you want to go and break their knees, we're not going to stop you. Go right ahead. And at some point, Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz tried to get Bush Sr. to warn Hussein, don't do it. But then he sent a message that they thought was actually way too weak and might encourage him to do it. So then they tried to get him to send a second message. And by then it was too late. The invasion happened. So you have essentially a massive failure to coordinate here, or possibly, you know, the CIA and State Department were deliberately trying to set up the Kuwaitis. But I have a quote here from a prominent Kuwaiti businessman who complained that the Kuwaiti royal family would never have stuck up to Saddam Hussein the way they did if they hadn't been egged on by the Americans to do so. So the whole thing, if you wanted to say, I mean, I'm sorry, Basevich, I respect, but he's just wrong about this. This was, in effect, a total setup. Saddam Hussein was about as innocent as an aggressive invading dictator could be in the circumstances, you know.
Well, I don't quote me on Basevich. I'd have to find the actual the interview. I'm just kind of going off memory.
No, I remember that. I remember.
You? Okay, you do.
In fact, I'll go ahead and say, if people want to look this up, Margaret Tutwiler, Tutwiler, Margaret Tutwiler, and John Kelly, both also from the State Department, gave statements. John Kelly told the House of Representatives, we don't have a defense treaty with the Gulf states. That's clear. And you remember Joseph Wilson, who was the husband of Valerie Plame, the former ambassador to Kuwait. He later said that John Kelly's statement in front of Congress had a lot more effect than anything April Glaspie may or may not have said, because he made it clear we have no legal obligation or even mechanism in place to react to an invasion. In fact, I'll go further here as long as we're on this, and I'm like actually really proving my case here. There's a great quote to from Stephen Walt from Foreign Policy in Harvard Magazine here. And I'm sorry, I got so many block quotes here. I'm trying to find it. But anyway, I can paraphrase. Essentially what Walt says is that if you look at the Glaspie memo, that where she says, like, even like the most harsh words that she uses. Oh, here it is. I'll go ahead and read it. It's short enough. He says, even Glaspie's statement that Bush is deeply interested in peace and stability in the Gulf can be read as something of a green light. If the president says he wants closer relations with Iraq, but doesn't want war in the Gulf, might Saddam have seen that as suggesting the United States wasn't about to fight to preserve Kuwaiti sovereignty? Remember, Saddam wasn't intending to fight a major war against Kuwait. He was just planning a coup de main. In other words, roll right in, right, and just take over the place with very little violence. Based on Glaspie's remarks, he might easily have concluded that Washington would ultimately acquiesce, however reluctantly, to his fait accompli. So she says, now listen, Saddam, we don't want to have to fight with you, or we don't want to fight with you. And he here could very well have heard that as, okay, you're not going to fight with me if I do this thing that you know I'm going to do, right? This is diplomatic language for go right ahead, or at least it very easily could have been interpreted like that, honestly, by the Iraqi side. After all, he was Ronald Reagan and George Bush's guy. Why would they stab him in the back? George Bush, in the Iraq-gate scandal, it came out that Bush was selling him weapons right up until the point he invaded Kuwait. The entire first half of 1990, he was still selling them weapons. So there's and in fact, James Baker said repeatedly to Richard Clarke that even after everything, he would never have launched Iraq War I if it had been up to him, the Secretary of State. He thought it was a stupid war and that Bush Sr. should not have done it. Of course, he went ahead and led us into it anyway. He was the Secretary of State during the thing, got the UN to vote for it and everything else. But he was being a good soldier at that point, basically. But he apparently used to mock George Bush and call him stupid and say he should have never done that. So, and that was the guy who essentially gave him the green light to go. James Baker, the Secretary of State, was the guy who gave him the green light to go. And then essentially like, why would we do anything about that? What do we care if Iraq takes over Kuwait?
Prior to Iraq War II, Keith Knight sent me a clip of a U.S. general, and I can't remember who it is for the life of me, but he basically is saying that we knew before we went into so prior to Iraq War I, we didn't roll through and try and stay and occupy the country and overthrow Saddam because we knew that if we did that, it would erupt in chaos and no one would be able to take over the country. Do you have any sense that that's true, that the U.S. military knew that what would happen if they were to try and occupy Iraq?
Oh, yeah. And I know the clip you're talking about, and I'm going to play it for you because it's just too good not to, man. It's awesome. Dick Cheney. It's Dick Cheney. He was the Secretary of Defense at the time. And in 1994, all through the 90s, the neoconservative hawks always said, oh, boo-hoo, you should have gone all the way to Baghdad. You should have finished the job. You didn't finish the job, and you should have. And so here's Dick Cheney, who was, I'm not exactly sure what his position was at the time, but I believe that he was in agreement with the rest of the leaders of the Bush senior administration to stop after they got him out of Kuwait and to not go all the way to Baghdad. But either way, here he is justifying Bush senior's position. Let me make sure I got no other audio playing here. Okay, good.
Themselves. Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
There you go, man. I mean, what else can you say?
Yeah, it's so prophetic. I mean, especially even going to what has happened in northern Syria with Turkey, right down to the T.
Well, and, so this is interesting, right, is to go back and parse that a little bit. You look at the pieces of Iraq flying off. Well, he's absolutely right that the Iranians got the east. But that was their policy from the very beginning, was to put Iran's best friends in power there, the Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party. And so, yep. And then when he talks about Syria would like to have the West, well, that's not exactly right. If Syria means the government in Damascus, the government in Damascus is already a minority dictatorship ruling over a 70% Sunni supermajority. They want to conquer all of Western Iraq and try to rule Mosul and Fallujah and Tikrit and Ramadi? Nuh-uh. There's no reason in the world. Oh, but you know who does, though? The Al-Qaeda guys. And once George Bush destroyed Iraq and once Obama destroyed Syria, then Al-Qaeda in Iraq was able to take over and consolidate power over eastern Syria and western Iraq and create the Islamic State. That's who wanted to take over western Iraq. The Bin Ladenites, who had never set foot in Iraq before Dick Cheney brought them in 2003.
And do you think that that's kind of the overall goal, is to break up all these secular nations into enclaves?
Well, I think that's plan B. Frankly, if you pay close attention what the neocons were pushing in the 1990s, these guys really thought it was going to be easy. So you do have Bernard Lewis and others saying what we should do is just break it all up. And you could argue that the plan to export democracy is kind of just a ruse for spreading the chaos. But I don't really think that's right. I don't think you need the most cynical interpretation. I mean, I think, like, if you look at Paul Wolfowitz in the Reagan years, when Ferdinand Marcos tried to stay in power after losing the election to Corazon Aquino in 1986 in the Philippines, Wolfowitz convinced Reagan that you've got to tell him to step down. And this lady, she's not a communist. She's not dangerous. But this guy, I mean, we preach all this stuff about democracy, and we're going to support this right-wing strongman in power. And he convinced Reagan, Wolfowitz convinced Reagan, that this democracy stuff really is important. It's not just window dressing. Now, I think that there's enough on his record to say that he really did believe in that stuff. The democratic peace theory, right? The democratic nations don't fight each other. And democratic, whatever. It's the end of history. The Americans won the Cold War, and we proved that market economics and regular elections, that's the future of all of humanity. And if we have to hurry it along with war and this kind of thing, then that's what we'll do. And so I think that was it really was, for many of the neocons and the right-wing hawks who went along with them, I think that was, a big part of their thinking, at least like for the background, for the overall project. But in the more narrow sense, the best thing that you can do, and it really sucks, but you got to do it, is read A Clean Break by David Wormser, and Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith signed off on it as well. It's called A Clean Break, A New Strategy for Securing the Realm. And the companion piece is called Coping with Crumbling States. And if you're really suicidal, you can read the book. It's called Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Remove Saddam Hussein. It's by David Wormser. And God help you if you read the whole thing like I did. But anyway, basically, it's kind of hard to sum up in a way for people who are new at this. But essentially, the idea was, if we get rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, then the king of Jordan will take over. And don't worry about the Shiite supermajority who are, friends with the Iranians, because the Hashemites, claim to be descended from Muhammad. And everybody knows Shiites like that kind of stuff. Never mind that actually the Shiites don't have any reverence for the Hashemite line at all. Their religion is, centered around, or their tradition is centered around Muhammad's son-in-law Ali. And I'm sure I got that wrong, but, very close to this thing. But it's not like, anybody who claims to be descended from Muhammad gets to boss the Shiites around or whatever. But this is what Wormser convinced himself, or allowed Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, to convince him, that if we get rid of Saddam, the king of Jordan will take over, and then he'll make a cat's paw out of the Iraqi Shiites. And then they will use their religious authorities as the keepers of the holy city of Najaf to steal Hezbollah in southern Lebanon away from Iran, to steal their loyalty away from Iran. And then the king of Jordan will tell the clergy in Najaf to tell Hezbollah to be nice to Israel, and will prevent Iran from arming Hezbollah by way of Syria. Now, if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, it's not only because I explained it so poorly, it's because that's how poorly it was thought out in the first place. The whole thing is completely nuts. Iran and Syria and Hezbollah are causing us a major problem. So let's get rid of Saddam Hussein? Huh? Yeah. And then it worked out exactly like you might have thought. They got rid of the Ayatollah's nemesis, Saddam Hussein, and guess who was empowered? Not the king of Jordan, not even Ahmed Chalabi. It was the Ayatollah Khamenei and his buddies. In fact, we started this talking about Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in the 80s. Well, these were the Iraqis who took Iran's side in 1980 and had fled to Iran and had fought on Iran's side in the war, choosing their Shiite sect over their Arab and Iraqi sect, so to speak. And so now these were the guys who came in. In fact, I skipped this part, but the Iraqi uprising after the first Gulf War, the reason Bush encouraged the uprising but then called it off was because these Iraqi Shiite militias were coming across the border from Iran to lead it. And he realized we just spent all this time for 8 years straight. We supported Saddam Hussein in the Reagan years in order to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now what are we doing? We're importing it into Iraq. And so that was why they freaked out and called it off and stabbed those Shia in the back and let Saddam Hussein massacre them all. That became the excuse for the no-fly zone. That became the excuse to stay in Saudi that got us attacked on September 11th, etc. Now 2003 comes. Everybody with me? Now 2003 comes. And George Bush invades. And what does he do? W. Bush. He picks up right where his father left off. When his father betrayed that Shiite uprising, Junior went ahead and finished the job for them. Not only did he get rid of Saddam, but he fought a 5-year civil war for them in order to drive all the Sunnis out of power or out of the city of Baghdad and turn it all into, all of South and Eastern Iraq into a pro-Iranian Iraqi Shiistan, which of course was a huge mistake, and which is why they backed al-Qaeda in Syria for all those years, was to try to hurt Assad in order to weaken Iran. Because if George Bush put them up 2 pegs with Iraq War II, then they would try to take them down a peg by taking Syria away from them. And of course, what happened, though, was that led to the rise of the Islamic State, which was essentially just so embarrassing for the Americans to have a bin Ladenite literal state created in Western Iraq that threatened the regime that Bush had put in power there in Baghdad. And so they had to launch Iraq War III to fight again for the same Shia they wish they hadn't have fought Iraq War II for in order to destroy the Islamic State. Now, anybody listening to this, take your audio editing equipment and put it all in order. But essentially, that's the whole story.
Yeah, right. Well, hang on there for a sec, Scott. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I hope that you're enjoying this episode. I just wanted to pause here to shout out my Patreon and Subscribe Star pages. You can find them at libertyweekly.net/Patreon or /Subscribe Star. And for just $3 a month, you can get access to the Liberty Weekly meme cache, behind-the-scenes pictures and video, early access to show audio only, plus a shout-out on the show like this and a personal thank you email. For $5 a month, you can get all of the above, plus access to supporter-only live streams and early access to full video versions of the show and bonus content. And I have a AMA coming up. I'm polling the Patreon group to see what time would work best for an AMA. I also have my recent interview I just did, actually, with Monica Perez and Brad Binkley. Full access to audio and video versions of that is already up on Patreon and Subscribe Star. For $10 a month, you get access to all the above, plus the Murray Rothbard repository, which is a searchable cache of recorded Murray Rothbard lectures. Plus, you get to join me one time a year for a show on my B-side podcast, Liberty Bigley. For $15 a month, you get all the above, plus a redeemable topic request for Liberty Weekly episode. And for $20 a month, you get all the above, plus you get to join me one time a year for a Liberty Weekly episode. So if a monthly support on Patreon and Subscribestar is not something that you're willing to do, go on over to libertyweekly.net/support, and you can see other ways to support me with one-time donations, or I have cryptocurrency addresses there as well, and I definitely love that. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your support. If you value my work, please check out those pages, and you get extra content from me. So thanks much. Back to the show. Just with our last little bit of time here, I wanted to ask you, I've listened to you long enough, Scott, to know that you, in your taxi driver days, you were a fan of the John Birch Society and were probably a bit more conspiracy minded than you are now. I guess my first question would be that, what's your position on the whole like Afghanistan poppy thing and the Contra, Gary Webb, CIA, cocaine, drug trafficking thing? Did you at one point think that they were trafficking these drugs to fund black operations with the Contras, but also with funding ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
Well, I mean, these things are very separate in time here. So, right, I mean, yeah, they did back the Mujahideen in the 1980s, but no, I don't think that was drug money that they were using to back the Mujahideen, other than just the CIA's kind of always involved in drug money. And actually, I shouldn't say that too definitively. I mean, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was one of the CIA's favorites in the Afghan-Pakistan war, he was a heroin dealer. I mean, how much of that really involved the CIA, other than just he was their guy and this was one of the things that was part of his business? I'm not really sure. I mean, it doesn't look to me like they were really the ones providing that money to him. That was him. But, the BCCI whole bank scandal was involved in the financing of the Mujahideen there. So, when it comes to these international, kind of black markets in drugs and in terrorism and in money laundering, there's always a lot of overlap. That's true. But, the reason that they were selling, to get to the Gary Webb thing, and we can get back to Afghanistan in a minute, like the more recent, like the current war in Afghanistan. But the Gary Webb thing, for people who aren't familiar, he was a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, and he was just a reporter, a straight edge guy. And he got this great scoop that the CIA was running cocaine into Southern LA, and he wrote it for the San Jose Mercury News, and it was called the Dark Alliance series. And he ended up writing a book about it, and I interviewed him. You can listen to my interview of him about it. And, the story essentially, he told the story about how the crack epidemic in LA in the 1980s, which helped fuel the rise of the Crips and the Bloods and a horrible war between them in fighting over turf and the spreading of the gangs and the gang culture and all that through the country and all that, was all CIA cocaine. That was behind all of that. And the reason that they were doing this because, again, the Democrats had outlawed spending any money on these death squads, something called the Boland Amendment, that made it where they couldn't spend money on supporting these death squads. So the CIA basically gave a blank check to their Contra friends to sell cocaine to poor black people in LA in order to pay for the war, which worked. And then, of course, the LA Times, which was essentially shamed to death for letting all of this go on under their nose, decided to go into full jihad against Webb and assigned like 10 reporters to destroy Webb. Don't verify his story. Don't see if there's anything to this. Try to find any comma out of place that you can use to crucify this guy and call him a kook and a liar and whatever. And they did destroy him. And his weak editors, his pathetic half men that were his editors, demoted him and put him on the Hollywood gossip page, and then eventually drove him out of there. He wrote a book about it and eventually went back to being, I think he had originally been, I think he went back, or at least he ended up being an investigator for congressional committees or something. But his journalist career was over, and the CIA mobilized the Washington Post against him too. And the thing is, every word of it was true. The only thing that wasn't true was something that he never wrote, but it was something that like the editors had added on a splash page that made it sound, I don't know the exact words, but it was something like it made it sound like the point was to cripple the black community with drug addiction, when that wasn't the point. The point was to make money for their secret death squads in Nicaragua and El Salvador. The black people, they didn't give a damn about. But the point wasn't to destroy them. It was just that they didn't care about them, which is bad enough. Thank you very much. But anyway, they glommed onto stuff like that to basically destroy Gary Webb, who was a great reporter. And I'm here to tell you that if he had held on just another year, I mean, really, just one more year, he would have found that, you know what, by 2005, there was enough good left-leaning independent media that he could have been okay. He could have written for Robert Perry at consortiumnews.com full-time. You know, he could have been one of us, you know, libertarians / left / paleocon, anti-war movement types for the last 20 years. And unfortunately, he gave up. And when I interviewed him, he was depressed as hell. And I know that people have all these conspiracy theories about his suicide. But if the CIA wanted to murder him, they would have murdered him before he put that story out or the day after. What they did do was absolutely destroy the man's life and drive him to suicide, which is the same thing. But he sold his house. He sold all his investments and whatever. He signed his life insurance and all his property over to his ex-wife's name. And I think someone had said that somebody stole his motorcycle was the last straw. He shot himself with his dad's old revolver. You know, this is not a CIA hit. This was a suicide. And yes, there were 2 wounds, but that happens. When people shoot themselves with guns, sometimes they flinch on the first one and they shoot themselves out the side of the mouth or something like that. And then, you know, it's what 2% of gun suicides are like this, something like that. And then go ahead and close your eyes tight and get it right on the second one is what he did, is what happened. And it was just a bunch of hucksters who pushed all this crap about him being murdered because they didn't care what the truth was. They didn't care about themselves. But the point is the CIA might as well have killed him. It's the same damn difference, right? Just like they might as well have bombed the towers. They exploited 9/11 to such a satanic degree that they might as well have done it. What's 3,000 more innocent dead people compared to the 2 million dead innocent people they've killed in the time since then in the name of it? You know? So same difference with Gary Webb. They didn't actually literally murder him, but they figuratively did, and they're just as guilty for it. But then when it comes to Afghanistan and the heroin there now, I mean, I have to tell you, the entire economy of Afghanistan is based on heroin. They don't grow any other thing. And this is part of the legacy of Jimmy Carter's war. You know, everybody always puts it all on Reagan, but it was Jimmy Carter who started it. And this was, you know, really the beginning of the end of Afghan farmers growing anything for money other than heroin, because there's just nothing that compares in terms, especially in terms of the ease of the turnover and the profit margin and the rest of it. And so, you know, their domestic food crops and all that, you know, and as part of it was the casualty of the wars. You know, they had these lush orchards on the Shamali Plain, and the various warlords in the 1990s destroyed them all, you know. So it was just, it was Alfred McCoy, the guy that wrote The Politics of Heroin about drug running during Vietnam, wrote that heroin was the knife that cut the Gordian knot, right? We have all these problems in Afghanistan. We got no money, and heroin is the answer. And so that's true for the Taliban, and that's true for the North and the East and the South and the West, the governors and the mayors and the members of parliament and the people that run the national government and the provincial governments and, you know, the warlords on all sides, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, the Pashtuns, and the Tajiks, and everybody's selling heroin. Everybody sells heroin in Afghanistan. And now, as far as the CIA, I'm sure I have no evidence of this whatsoever, other than that movie, the TV series, The Punisher. But I'm sure that some CIA guys are getting rich selling heroin, you know, for their own lush accounts and this kind of deal. But as a policy, in the way that they did it in the 1980s, I don't know why they would. I mean, George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, the U.S. Congress, they write blank checks to the intelligence agencies. I won't call them the community. I hate that crap. But to these government employees, they can spend all the money they want, and they could counterfeit money if they want to, if they need to. So I don't and in fact, I talked with Alfred McCoy. He's the best guy I ever talked to about Afghan heroin before. And I asked him if he thought that you had the same kind of rings going on that you had during Vietnam and especially in Latin America in the 80s. And he was saying he didn't know of it. Like it could be, but it's more above board than that, right? Like I say, every major politician in the country, pro and anti-American, are essentially in on this heroin economy. It's just part of the entire thing. It underlies the whole thing.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And I hope I didn't unfairly portray you as someone who believed in conspiracies before, but if you did at one point.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I'll mention about the Birchers. I never was a right winger.
Yeah.
And I never liked their social issues stuff. And I'm not saying I was 100% on board with all their stuff, but I really did believe in the one world government stuff until the Bush years came and proved that that's just not what's going on here. And secondly, I really like their attention to just empire as suicide. Leftists are totally right when they talk about how bad the American empire is for the rest of the world. But right-wing, paleo-conservative, anti-war types, well, and the Birchers are a whole different breed even than the paleos, but they're essentially along the lines of paleo-conservatives. When they're anti-war because it's bad for this country. It's bad for this society, not just for our soul walking around guilty of mass murder, but for the way that we relate to each other, the power that our national government has over the economy and, the entire order of things, the federalization of everything, the militarization and centralization of police power. They've changed America just in 20 years into something absolutely unrecognizable, even from the police state of the 1990s we were already living in. And it's all in the name of the war. And you can't complain because don't you know there's a war on? Don't you know they're going to kill us if we don't give up this, that, and the other thing to power to keep us safe? And it becomes the excuse, the blank check to turn a republic into a totalitarian state. And it sucks. And it's completely unnecessary. And anyone looking at a 2020 calendar, December 2020, and saying that things are going on schedule and this is how it's supposed to be, I bet you couldn't even find me one outside of DC anyway.
Yeah, my grandpa was a Bircher, and I should show you an op-ed he wrote in the local newspaper against Iraq War I. It's something to be proud of. But hey,
absolutely, man.
I want to be respectful of your time here, Scott. Do you want to plug anything like your forthcoming book?
Sure. Like I say, I'm really sorry it's late. I threw out. It's like the long version is like 500 pages and not done, and I threw it out and started all over. And the new version is like 260, and I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut it down. I'm going to really try to keep it at 250. I want it to be 150. I keep proving my case instead of just claiming things. It's hard to not. But anyway, I really, really, really am working hard on it now, and I really want it to be out by Inauguration Day or right thereabouts. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen with that, but it is nearly done, and it's going to be called Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time, man. It was great to talk to you. This is the first time I've interviewed you, so thanks so much, and looking forward to reading your work.
All right, cool, man. Well, thanks very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, Patrick.